I think what we're going to do is we're going to have Peter talk a little bit. I may have a question or two. You may have a question or two. It would be not terrible if we got out of here a little before 1. I know he's got some other things to do. So I'm just going to kind of run through a quick bio. I don't think he needs a whole lot of introduction. He's been on the New York Times bestseller list 7 times, including the most recent #1 New York Times bestselling book, Red Handed: How American Elites Get Rich Helping China Win. I think he'll be talking quite a bit about that. He's also has 3 other previous #1 bestsellers. He formed the Government Accountability Institute, I believe, in 2012. Team of researchers, writers, editors, fact checkers, really working to uncover those politicians who abuse their power, their public service, particularly those that like to do that in favor of padding their own pockets. Prior to that, he was a consultant to the Office of Presidential Speechwriting for President George W. Bush. It just sounds so cool that he also served as a member of the Ultra Terrorism Study Group at the U.S. government's Sandia National Laboratory. I mean, that's pretty cool. I would like that on my resume. 11 of his books have been, his books have been translated into 11 different languages. I think we've all seen him as a common guest commentator, TV, radio. I think podcasts are becoming big as well now. Articles in just about every major publication that you can imagine. He's got a degree from George Washington, a master's from Oxford University, lives in Tallahassee with his wife and 2 children. Peter Schweizer. Thank you for coming today.
It's great to be here, and I have to say, I've got a friend that has moved down from New York and joined us at the Government Accountability Institute. He and his wife lived in the New York area, Westchester County, for 30 years, and they are getting adjusted to life in Florida. And they are amazed at how nonchalant we are, that there's this hurricane moving up the Gulf Coast. And they've had a few surprises as they've moved along. When they first got here, the initial concern was alligators, right? We all know how gators function, and if you kind of keep your distance, everything's fine. They had the initial panic about alligators. Then they discovered these lizards that love to run into your house. That caused some problems. And now came the hurricane. I almost had him convinced that he should want the hurricane because the hurricane will blow away the gators and the lizards. But I don't think he was buying it. But anyway, it sounds like we're in very good hands. We appreciate the work that everybody does to keep us safe, and it sounds like we're going to dodge this storm. So we're very grateful for that. I'm actually working on a book project now. I got a call from Catherine last night asking if I could do this, and as I've said before, it's always like a family reunion being here, so I was glad to come. I don't have a prepared speech, but what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about what's going on in the world, what may be going on in the state generally, but honestly, and I mean this sincerely, my hope is this will foster a conversation. This is not just going to be me pontificating oftentimes on things I may not know a whole lot about, but rather we can have a conversation and people can raise the issues that are concerning for them, because after all, this is an election year. And with all the frustrations and anger that people have on both sides of the aisle, we still live in the greatest country on the planet. And I believe we live in the greatest state in the greatest country in the planet. So let's not lose that perspective. So I'm going to start big and look at global events, and I'm going to talk nationally about the economy and what I think the state of politics are, and then I'm going to open it up for conversation. So please have your questions, your comments, your challenges, your Peter, you don't know what you're talking about comments, because it will make things, I think, a lot more interesting. So let's look at the globe. A lot of global events that are going on, some that are obvious, some that are less obvious. First thing, of course, is we've got the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion, and the dramatic events there. A lot of people feel it's distant, it doesn't really affect us. It does. If you don't believe that, look at something called the global energy crisis that we're facing. It is real, and it's caused by the fact that we have a global energy economy. Part of that is because domestic energy production in the United States has waned a bit in the last few years, but the larger problem is we have a global energy situation. I would say things look pretty dire for Ukraine. initially with the invasion, but thank goodness, and I hope this won't offend anybody, but I'm quite happy that Ukraine seems to be kicking ass. Because I think that Putin and the Russian forces deserve it. I don't think we should assume that's going to lead to greater stability, because it's not. I think the war is going to grind on, and I think that Putin is going to become increasingly desperate, and that means we can expect more disruptions, not only to the energy supply, but to the global food supply. Now again, we may think and assume that so much of what we consume in terms of food comes locally. It comes from the Panhandle. It comes maybe from Georgia. The fact of the matter is a lot of grains and soybeans that are used not only for breads but also to feed livestock comes from the true breadbasket of the world, which is Ukraine. And Ukraine is in the midst of a war, so we should expect there to be disruptions in food supplies. It's probably not going to affect us here as dramatically as it will Africa and other parts of the third world, but it is going to be a real problem. So when it comes to that conflict, we have to recognize and acknowledge that there are still things to be quite concerned about. Let's move to the other side of the planet and look at China, which I believe is a bigger challenge to the United States and a bigger threat than Russia presents. And this happens on a couple of levels. The first is simply economics. If you look at the United States today and where our economy is trending and going, we are increasingly dependent upon China, not just for toys, not just for clothing, but for very critical products. To give you one example, anybody here take prescription drugs occasionally? Prescribed, of course, prescription drugs. I do. You know, if you take those, 80 to 90% of those are actually produced in China. 80 to 90% of our pharmaceuticals. And keep in mind, you might say, well, why do I care about that? During COVID, and questions that were being raised in the United States about the origins of the COVID-19 virus, and I believe that it came from China, and I believe it was probably a lab leak. But China got so angry that the United States was even raising this issue that a member of the Chinese Foreign Ministry threatened to cut off pharmaceutical supplies to the United States in retaliation. They didn't do that, of course, but that is a dependency and a threat that remains, that is very real. And I think we have to factor that and keep that in mind. I think the second thing we have to focus on is the fact that Beijing is increasingly injecting itself into American politics. I've written about this, I've spoken about this here before. It's a problem for both political parties. You frankly have Republicans and Democrats in Washington, D.C., and they increasingly want to get involved at the state level, where Beijing is basically creating commercial opportunities for politicians and their family members. They get wealthy, and those politicians end up taking policy positions that are highly favorable to Beijing. They call this elite capture, and it works. And again, it involves people at the highest levels of both political parties. What that effectively means is, as Beijing becomes increasingly assertive, our political class in Washington increasingly, I fear, is looking the other way and not responding in kind. So those are very real concerns that we have politically and on the global stage. Let's talk briefly about the national scene. The national scene, my biggest concern, there are a lot of heated issues and discussions that I think are important and legitimate. My biggest concern comes down to one word when it comes to Washington, D.C. Spending. Spending. Now, people talk about spending all the time. Why am I particularly concerned about that right now? Well, if you look at the problem of inflation, everybody here has felt inflation, right? Hovering around 8%. Real problem, pinching a lot of people. There are two things that contribute to inflation in terms of governmental policy. One is the amount of money that the Federal Reserve is printing. The more money they print, the more dollars you have chasing the same amount of goods, you're going to get inflation. So what is the Federal Reserve doing? They are raising interest rates and they are reducing the amount of money they're printing. So, okay, good. Federal Reserve is doing their job to tamp down on one of the causes of inflation. Here's the problem. The other cause of inflation, if one cause is printing money, the other cause is government spending. The more that the federal government spends, especially at a high level, again, you have more dollars chasing the same amount of goods, you're going to get inflation. The Federal Reserve is doing its job. Congress and the White House is not doing their job. They are spending money like drunken sailors, and I say that knowing that that is an insult to drunken sailors. Because it's really outrageous what's gone on. We're not even talking about billions of dollars now, we're talking about trillions of dollars that are being spent. And here's the problem, it doesn't seem like it's going to change, and as the Federal Reserve continues to raise interest rates, if inflation does not come down, they will continue to raise interest rates. And if our Congress and our president do not stop spending, they're going to have to continue to raise interest rates, and we could be in a situation where we have interest rates of 10 or 12% and still have 6 or 7% inflation. So it is not a good situation. There's plenty of blame to go around, and what I would frankly regard as giveaways that are being offered in many instances. But we can certainly debate it, whether it's the student loan, which is probably going to be $1 trillion, whether it's a lot of the money that was spent related to COVID, that was stimulus that has been poorly spent. We're again talking about trillions of dollars, and that's an enormous problem. So I don't want to paint a completely bleak picture. It surprises a lot of people. Catherine will tell you is that generally I'm an optimist. So how am I an optimist when it comes to what is happening in our country and the challenges we face? We are dynamic, we are innovative, we are creative, and the American character of hard work and integrity still matters. The things that we see on the news are always going to be the negative things. So we are going to hear about the political figures who are engaged in corrupt acts. As I always try to say, there are political figures who are working hard and trying to do the right thing. And I may not agree with them on their policy positions, but they are trying to do the right thing. And we have to recognize that what we get in a news cycle is because newspapers and news outlets and cable news gets an audience by giving you bad news, not by giving you good news, right? Now, they're going to cover the hurricane. They're not going to cover the, oh, it's a sunny, beautiful day in Florida today. Let's have a camera there and tell everybody about it, because nobody's going to listen. So what I would say to you as you're getting ready to vote and you're contemplating where the country is, we have very real and serious problems that need to be tackled. I would always say, don't judge political figures by what they say. Judge them by what they're actually doing. And that can be difficult, by the way, to find accurate information sometimes. But dig for it, find it, ask the tough questions. And it comes down to accountability. Because here's the thing. If you get disgusted and frustrated and you say, you know what, I'm sick of it, I'm not going to get involved anymore, the corrupt political class wins. Because that's what they want. They want people that care not to vote. They want people that care not to be engaged. What they want are people that vote at a very, sort of low level, that don't care about those issues, because then they're not being held accountable. So those are the comments I'd leave you with today. I want to hear what is interesting to you. What are you concerned about? And whether you think I'm wrong on the state of the country or some of these issues. And thank you for listening.
So if you have a question, please let Catherine know, and I know we've got one back over here in the back right corner. So real quick, can you talk a little bit about, since it is an election year, while we get primed up for questions, concerns you may have with election security and whether or not that is China, Russia, or even in our own backyard? What is your confidence level that we don't have any issues come November?
Yeah, I think that this is a question that comes up a lot, and again, we've had political figures from both political parties that when they lose, challenge the integrity of the election. I think you can certainly do that. I think the question is, do you actually have evidence to indicate that what happens? I do think that election security and integrity is an important issue, and I think we need to focus on it, and I think there are some basic rules. I think generally we have them in place in Florida. that are very effective. The problem comes with a lot of the policies that were enacted during COVID in 2020 that were done out of a concern for people's health and safety and participation. And my biggest concern is frankly with very loose standards for mail-in ballots. And here's why. Here's why. The consensus has really been forever in American political history that mail-in ballots are a bad idea. There was a commission in 2006 that included Jimmy Carter and James Baker, who was the Secretary of State under George H.W. Bush. So it was a bipartisan coalition that investigated voter integrity. They said that mail-in ballots were the worst as far as ballot integrity. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? When you're concerned about whether a vote is going to be accurately counted and accurately recorded and reflects what the person wants, it's essentially a function of the person filling out the ballot and putting it in a secure place, scanning in the machine like we do at Leon County, which I think is a good idea. That's what you're looking for in integrity, and making sure, of course, that the system counts it accurately. The problem with mail-in ballots, especially if you have loose standards about, no signatures, that kind of thing, you don't actually know whose ballot it is. Unless you're prepared to fingerprint the envelopes, which of course would be ridiculous, you don't know whose ballot it is. And I think we all saw the news reports. There were those in Nevada, particularly in Las Vegas. There were those in Pennsylvania, where the election offices sent out voter registrations to, in some cases, I think there was a case in Las Vegas where there was a single apartment that 16 ballots were sent to, mail-in ballots were sent to. And these reflected people that had lived in that apartment over the last 10 years. People move around, people jump around. And in Nevada, they basically took the position that they were not going to verify signatures. That's a huge problem, and you open yourself up for abuse, particularly in an environment where, I think we can all acknowledge, we are generally a 50-50 country. I mean, elections are pretty narrow and pretty contested. So I think that is an enormous problem, and I think that if we can come to some consensus on those basic rules, I think we generally have them here in Florida, that will go a long way forward in dealing with that concern. So you have the issue of mail-in ballots. The other one is what you call ballot harvesting, or in South Florida they call granny farming. And this is where people actually go around and help individuals, particularly nursing homes, fill out their ballots, and then those people carry those ballots back to the ballot box. Ballot harvesting is not legal in most states. It is legal in California and others. And again, it's an enormous problem because you don't know the actual integrity of the ballot. And when somebody shows up with 40 ballots that they've collected from a nursing home, you don't really know the status, particularly because the people collecting those ballots are not employees, they're not members of a local government. These are generally nonprofit advocacy groups. So those are the two major concerns that I have, and I think we need to watch those very, very carefully, or we're going to continue to have questions raised about the integrity of elections, and I think that's very, very scary. Yes?
Two quick questions. One, has your book, Red Handed, been translated into Chinese?
Not that I'm aware of. I will say I wrote a book on the end of the Cold War about how the United States defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War called Victory, and the strategy employed by Reagan. That book was actually translated by the Chinese Ministry of Defense, but I didn't get a royalty for that. So.
Okay. Second question, you said you were working on a new book. Could you tell us what the subject of your next?
Not really.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I can't. Really not. The book's not due until next summer, so I'm still trying to figure things out. But thank you for asking.
It's my understanding that China has been buying a lot of farmland in the United States, and that at least in one case it was close to a military base. Do you want to comment on what they're up to?
Yeah, it's a problem. I mean, look, we've always welcomed foreign investment. And foreign investment, as long as very tight strings are not attached, I think is a good thing. The problem when it comes to China is that many of these purchases are being made by not sort of an entrepreneur who just, built a great widget and now is buying land in the United States. These are people that are connected to the Chinese Communist Party apparatus. In the case you're talking about in North Dakota, it's farmland near a very sensitive U.S. military base. The gentleman who's buying the land is a retired PLA general, retired general in the People's Liberation Army. And the problem in the United States is we do not have, we're not really good at collecting data on who is buying real estate. So one of the problems they've had in New York and in Los Angeles and other parts of California is a lot of foreign nationals will simply set up an LLC, a limited liability company, in Delaware. They will hire a lawyer in Delaware to be the quote-unquote owner or proxy for the LLC. And then foreign nationals will use that LLC to buy all kinds of real estate in the United States, effectively masking who owns it. So it's a huge problem. As it relates to the farmland, the other thing I would add is concerns we should have about food supply. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, Chinese companies have been buying American agricultural companies. You remember Smithfield, the big pork producing company, was bought by a Chinese company 10 years ago. Something pretty troubling happened during COVID. If you remember, in the summer of 2020, there were food shortages that was partly prescribed to supply chain and that sort of thing. But there were food shortages, and some of it was related to pork and meat shortages. Smithfield, owned by a Chinese company producing pork in the United States, at that time was actually dramatically increasing their exports of pork to China because China was facing a similar sort of food shortage. So we have the added problem of agricultural companies owned by Chinese entities that if we're in a crisis situation like another pandemic, if the Chinese government leans on them, they are going to pick to ship food to China before they ship it, around the United States. So that should be another major concern that we have in this area.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Back here. Hey. Fake news. God, you can't go a day without something. Obviously, you do tons and tons of research. What sources do you use, and which ones do you think are the most fair and accurate in reporting where you get information from?
It's a good question. I mean, there's two levels, one professionally and one sort of as a consumer of news information. As far as a consumer is concerned, I would say read a variety of sources. Don't rely on just one or two, and rely on those that have maybe different perspectives. So I would say watch Fox News and CNN, or watch Fox News and read the New York Times, or read the Wall Street Journal and watch MSNBC. I would mix it up a little bit. I am politically conservative. That's sort of my perspective. So I like news that affirms the way that I see things. We all are kind of like that. But that doesn't always mean that it's the most accurate representation of what's going on. And it's hard to know. I was a subscriber to the New York Times for 25 years. Got it at home, sat down and read it every day. A lot of those news outlets that used to be kind of regarded as the glue that everybody said, okay, yeah, New York Times is kind of liberal, but generally they're going to give you a pretty accurate representation. Those news outlets have generally gone sideways. And so it's very hard to know where to get accurate information. So as a consumer, I look for a variety of sources, and I try to look away from sort of hyperbolic opinion. So I'll give you an example, a faraway example, but I think one that's very pertinent. Italy is going to get its first female prime minister, probably in the next couple of days, and she is politically conservative. If you can do two things. You can, number one, go and listen right now to CNN's perspective, which is that this is the new Benito Mussolini of Italy. And I mean, they will say that. Even though former Italian prime ministers who are on the other side of the aisle says that's not true, that's what CNN is saying. Then you can go and actually see what her party platform is and what she stands for. It has nothing to do with fascism. It's not even related. So I'm using that as an example. Stay away from opinion and labels and try to focus on sort of the original source. Now again, a political figure like her, she could lie, but if you look at their platform, what they stand for, what people voted for, that's a pretty good indication. And that's what I rely on. When it comes to my research, we generally rely on original sources, which is corporate records, documents, legal documents, etc. We only use news sources if we can independently verify the factuality of that data. So, long and boring answer, I apologize. Other questions? Yes, Dottie.
You know, I don't need a microphone. Bob, who's waiting?
Here she comes.
I was making a joke to him.
Okay, first of all, in China, well, in Italy, they require students to study 3 languages. In China, they require students to study 5 languages, so they don't need to translate your book. They can read it. And we already know how smart they are. Okay, as for your neighbors or new friends, please tell them don't feed the alligators. I'm serious. We've had alligators at my lake who come out of the ground, who come out of the lake. Actually, they sit and watch the...
They are scared to death of alligators. No
Oh, good.
concern that they're going to
Perfect. Okay.
No concern.
Okay. My question is, well, actually, I have several, but do you think that after the November election, presuming the conservative branch wins, do you think that they will be able to remove many of the higher echelon who have already violated our Constitution and our federal law and in doing what they've been doing in the past year to break our country, which I believe is part of their deal with China?
Well, I think that if you, most projections are that Republicans are going to retake the House and have a shot at taking the Senate. And I think the House, if you look, they'll show you these general ballots, you know, where generally speaking, you're going to vote for Republican and Democrat. That's less important than if you look at the actual battleground congressional districts. And the polling there shows, at least right now, Republicans are up by 11%, which is extraordinarily high. Probably not going to stay that high, but so I think the House is going to switch to Republican hands. My guess would be, I'm terrible at this, would be they're probably going to pick up 30 to 50 seats. The Senate, it's probably less than a 50% chance that Republicans will get that because there are more Republicans up for re-election than Democrats. Here's the issue. The issue is if the Republicans have a House, and even if they have a House in the Senate, there are only limited things they can do. The most important one in my mind is that they have investigative ability, which is they have an oversight committee in both the House and the Senate that has subpoena power. So like a law enforcement agency, one of the issues I focused on and that we first broke the story in 2018 involves Hunter Biden and his China deals. Those committees can actually subpoena Hunter Biden and say, come up here under oath, talk to us. If you don't, you can go to jail. And if you don't believe that, that's the situation Steve Bannon's in right now because he was subpoenaed by a congressional committee, refused to show up, and a jury convicted him of contempt of Congress. So investigative ability is an important component of it. There is the prospect, it seems to be all the rage over the last 5 years, there is the possibility that they could try to impeach Joe Biden. The House would vote on that, and then the trial would occur in the Senate. But again, they would not have the votes in the Senate for that to happen. So in terms of removal, that's not a possibility. But I think oversight is incredibly important, especially if you want to have accountability, concerns that people have about the way the FBI and others, and including the IRS, have dealt with certain issues. You get that sunlight by getting the oversight from the congressional committees. And I think that's one of the reasons having divided government in this case is really, really important. So somebody's watching. So I hope that answers your question.
Peter, I get right here to your right.
To my right. Oh, head table. Oh.
Yes, I get the last question from the
Be
audience.
nice, you. Be nice.
Yes, I will. You've written a lot about corruption in Washington. There's a lot of FBI raids going on, but the best I can tell, there's no FBI raids on anybody that you've written about in corruption. Is there going to be any type of justice or any type of action taken on some of these folks that you've written about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one of the concerns that people have raised is what I think a lot of people see as sort of the selective nature of the way that law is being enforced. I mean, I'll give you sort of one example. Donald Trump's campaign manager in 2016, a guy named Paul Manafort, a former lobbyist, went to jail, and rightfully so, because, among other things, he violated the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which was passed by Congress in the 1930s, enforced by the Justice Department, that says explicitly you cannot represent a foreign government or a foreign government entity with any U.S. elected official without registering with the Department of Justice. And failure to do so means jail time. Paul Manafort went to jail because he violated that, and he should have gone to jail. In the case of Hunter Biden, he did the same thing. He got paid by foreign entities. He took up matters with the federal government. There's even on his laptop emails where his business partners say, shouldn't we be registering under FARA for this? I think this is against the law if we don't. And he never registered under FARA. So the question comes out, why are you, in the case of Paul Manafort, showing up with a SWAT team, FBI SWAT team, to arrest him? And one of the other cases, you're completely ignoring it. And that is a major concern. It's a major concern among people in the FBI as well. Now, when it comes to Hunter Biden, there's a grand jury that was convened in 2018. It was about 5 months after my first book came out. That grand jury continues to meet. They took a 18-month suspension during COVID because what were considered non-essential grand juries stopped meeting out of healthcare concerns. That grand jury is meeting. It's unclear where it's going, but they're looking into 5 things. One of them is tax evasion. Again, it's clear from the emails, Hunter Biden received tens of millions of dollars in compensation, did not pay federal taxes on it. After the grand jury was convened, he said oops and sent a $2 million check to the IRS. That should not get you out of legal jeopardy. But the point is, they're looking at that, they're looking at the FARA issue, they're looking at issues related to political corruption and others. I don't know what the grand jury is going to do, but what I will say is this. My view has always been, when it came to the initial reporting about Trump related to Russia and allegations which ended up not being correct, my view was they have to be investigated. They have to be looked at, whoever the political figure is. We, in my opinion, have a problem in this country that certain rules apply to certain people and not to other people, and political affiliation is part of it. That is a problem. I would use it in the case involving Trump right now and the classified documents. Again, my view is they should be investigating this. I know he was president, but you do not have the authority outside of a process to just declare that a document is yours and classified. So they should be investigating it. But there's really very little difference between what Trump did and what Hillary Clinton did in 2016. Let's remember, she set up a server that she did not tell anybody about. She stored, the FBI said this, Jim Comey said this, she stored at minimum dozens of top secret documents on that server. When she was asked to provide her server to the Department of Justice and the FBI when they find out about it, she used BleachBit to clean the server. So you're basically destroying evidence the FBI wants. And remember, there was a famous incident. They had the government phones, again, which had emails with classified documents, which they smashed with a hammer. They specifically said, we are not going to prosecute Hillary Clinton because we cannot prove intent. Okay? I mean, to me, the question is, you're either going to consistently apply the law or not. It should not depend on whether you hate the political person. I'm not a Hillary Clinton fan. I want her to be investigated and to be done justly, and I think it should be done whether you have a D or an R after your name. It's a huge problem, and if you look at the history of countries and civilizations that have undergone decline, the biggest concern in terms of people's attitudes, whether they have faith in the government, is actually not elections. Now, I think elections are key, they're vitally important. It's not elections, it's the perceived unfairness of the judicial system. If people believe the judicial system is going to be rigged in terms of certain people and against other people based on political affiliation, religious views, or whatever it is, you are going to undermine faith in the country. And unfortunately, that's, I think, a big concern that we have right now.